This is Joshua with Surfray, and welcome to today's presentation on effective requirements gathering for search in SharePoint 2010. For anybody that watches the new webinars that Surfray provides every other week, you're in for a great change of pace this week with today's presentation. Our friend Michal Pisarek has a great topic, so without much delay I do want to hand over the mic. Just a reminder that for more presentations on SharePoint Search, check out the Resources tab at surfray.com. And with that, I'll let Michal take it away.
So good morning everyone, and welcome to the 11th of the 11th of the 11th at 11 a.m. incidentally, for this presentation entitled Effective Requirements Gathering for Search in SharePoint 2010. My name is Michal Pisarek, and I'm going to be your host for around about the next half an hour as we delve down into the area of really getting effective requirements for your search implementation. A little bit of an agenda today. We're going to start off with a bit of an introduction about myself, and then we're going to move right into the meat of the presentation. And I want to talk about firstly why requirements are needed for search. There's a bit of a misconception out there from a lot of clients that I work with, and I think out there in the industry in general, that you can simply turn search on and you're going to get a fantastic search solution. You are going to get some benefits, sure, but you need to craft your search solution around your user needs. Then we're going to talk about a bit of an overview of requirements. What makes a good requirement? Conversely, what makes a bad requirement for search as well? Requirements gathering for search is a little bit interesting because you can't ask direct questions. You need to go about it another way, and we'll cover that. And finally, I'm going to touch on some of the techniques that I use and that I found particularly beneficial for search requirements. A little bit about myself. I am a SharePoint MVP based out of Vancouver, Canada, but if you can understand my accent, then you realize that I'm actually from Australia. Extensive work with search. I am the author of the SharePoint Analyst HQ blog, which contains a number of my ramblings, a lot around search, and I'm a SharePoint analyst, so I have a foot in each camp, a little bit of business and a little bit of technical stuff in there as well. And I'm a huge proponent of search. I really think search is such a valuable tool that a lot of organizations aren't getting the best use out of. Okay, so let's talk about a frequently asked question and really why requirements are needed for search. And it's actually pretty simple. It really falls down to this following slide. You don't want to assume that simply by turning search on that you're providing your users with an amazing search experience that they deserve. The default scopes, metadata, results pages, and refiners are great, but they're probably not going to cut it for every single organization or for your situation. And the only way to craft a really compelling search solution is to find out what users want, to find out what users need. And that is why you need to go through the process of gathering these requirements. Now, fortunately out there's some issues in terms of search deployments and search requirements in particular. Search is usually seen as a quick win, and it's left until last. And there's also this expectation around search of it just working. So for some organizations, just having any search is seen as a quick win, but that usually dissipates after people try to use the search and find out that it doesn't work. There's also the issue of the process of implementing search. Most of the time, from what I've seen, search isn't really tested. The only testing that occurs with search is an administrator typing in the word test and hoping that anything comes up. The other thing as well is gathering requirements for search can be tricky, and that's why I'm here. You can't ask users fairly obvious questions. You can't ask them, what are your requirements around search? You have to go about it in a little bit of a different way. And measuring success for search can be a little bit difficult. It can be tricky, but I'm going to give you some tips later on which will hopefully help in that regard as well. And really the foundation of a good search stems from a solid base of other elements. But put simply, you can't have good or great search if you've got rubbish content. And really it falls down to these 5 basic things. Your information architecture is going to provide the context to your users to be able to expose relevant search results. Your usage patterns are going to help you understand maybe your architecture requirements and how users look for information and their expectations. Business process modeling is going to allow you to determine how, why, and when people look for information. Continuous improvement is going to make sure that your search is always on the path to improvement. There's not a perfect search experience, but it could always get better. And finally, governance. Governance is going to make sure that you both have an effective search vision and that your search is up and running successfully. So let's talk about search requirements, and in particular what makes a good search requirement and what makes a bad search requirement. And let's start with the bad examples first. First of all, the worst thing that you can do is just not actually ask your users at all and not get them involved in the whole search requirements gathering process. The other thing that I find happening as well is two things. Either asking direct questions that users can't easily answer. If you ask a user, what are your requirements around search, they're going to tell you something like, I want to be able to search on any item, and the top result should be what I'm thinking. It's not going to work. The other thing as well is asking users far too technical questions, especially business users. You should never be asking your end users, so what scopes do you think you need? Or tell me about the refiners that you would like to see. These questions are far too technical in nature. There's no context for end users to be able to answer these questions. And of course, the classic examples I've got listed up here. Every single day when I go into a client or I see a search business case, there's things like Google-like search experience, and we need it to be intuitive, written on most search business cases. This is far too vague. There's no way that you can implement a Google-like search experience. You can tell your clients or your users, if you like a Google-like search experience, then if you provide, 1/10 of the $6 billion in funding that Google has, that we can go about this process. But if you gather good requirements, you can create a really amazing, effective solution. And one technique that the business analysis community uses to ensure that your requirements are good is the SMART acronym. And SMART is a great way to ensure that your requirements are of a decent standard that you can use. It stands for 5 things. It's actually an acronym: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So you need specific requirements, something that you can actually implement. Anything that you're unsure of will not do. So Google-like search experience or better search is not a great requirement. They need to be measurable. You need to be able to measure the difference that this particular requirement is going to make. It has to be attainable. It has to be technically feasible. Maybe it's not technically feasible at the moment if you have a search roadmap, but it has to be technically feasible in the future. It should be relevant to the search vision, so you need to have an appropriate vision. And it should be time-bound as well. When should this requirement be evaluated? Or if it's not going to be evaluated or implemented now, we can put this in our search roadmap. So let's talk about a pretty decent example of a search requirement. So this is actually from a real-life example. So a lady told me, when I search for my name, I want to see the content I modified, ordered by date, because it takes me 30 minutes per day to find things sometimes. I work mainly on Excel files, so they would be more relevant than other types of documents. I also need to know the type of content and the size of file. Now let's apply SMART to this. We can say that things are specific. There's specific things that I can implement and pull out of here. Content that I modified. I want them to be ordered by date. I have some inkling about relevance, and I know what to show on maybe the custom search results pages, the type of content, and the size of file. For measurable, I can see that if it currently takes her 30 minutes per day, and we implement search and all of a sudden it takes her 5, then we're doing pretty well. Attainable, most probably, there's some simple configuration that we can do. Would I say this is relevant? If it's part of the search vision, absolutely. And time-bound. You would have to ask your users and indeed your search team when this is going to be implemented. SMART's a really good way to make sure that you get accurate search requirements. So that's my first tip for today. So let's touch upon some search requirements techniques. And these are techniques that I've found to be particularly successful in gathering requirements around search. So first, a simple flow. This is a super simple flow for gathering search requirements. It's much like any other type of requirements gathering activity or elicitation activity that you're going to do for requirements around SharePoint. So current state analysis concerns itself with understanding the current organization in order to make better decisions, both better requirements decisions and better implementation decisions. The requirements elicitation part is when you're actually going to gather your requirements. The expert judgment involves taking your business and user requirements and mapping these to functional requirements or functional specs. You should never be asking your users technical questions. And finally, you've got verification. Verification ensures that you understand the requirements that your users are working for, and if you're doing a POC or a rapid prototyping approach, that you're also getting some feedback on the implementation that you're doing. Now, there's multiple different ways to gather search requirements, but really the main aim of any technique that you use is to determine what your users need. Then you can take those business or user requirements, map them to functional requirements, and hopefully have created a really great search solution. Let's talk about current state analysis. And the goal of current state analysis is to help you understand the current organizational context to help inform search decisions. And there's 4 things that I frequently do here: the vision, the content analysis, identifying stakeholders, and creating personas. The vision revolves around what is the role of search within the organization beyond just finding stuff, and there can be many different visions for search. For some organizations, it's using search to increase innovation by exposing other content. For others, it's increased access to experts. Some others want increased compliance through the servicing of legal content. And for others, it's search-driven applications. The vision for your search is going to help you target those requirements gathering activities that are going to give you the most value. The other thing is you need a content analysis. You need to understand the type of content in the organization. If you understand the type of content and its value, once again, this is a great input into your requirements gathering activities. You don't want to spend too much time gathering requirements around content which is unsuitable to search or simply doesn't get used. Stakeholders. You need to understand who the stakeholders are within your search solution, who you're going to ask questions to, what they do, and how they are involved in the success of search as a whole. And finally, personas. You need to understand the roles that are going to use search. Not every person within an organization is going to use search exactly the same way. It helps you ensure that your search implementation gets maximum coverage for the most amount of people. It also helps you avoid the situation when an executive demands that 20% of the search budget is spent on a search implementation for his team, which consists of roughly 3 people out of 1,000. If you can show him the persona groups, you've got a really great argument. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. I'm going to talk about vision and about content. And I've mentioned before, the vision is going to define your approach to requirements gathering exercises. And you need a vision in every project, particularly SharePoint projects, because there's so much you can do. Now, you also need a vision around your search. And the way that I get a shared understanding or a vision is to run a visioning workshop. And a workshop's a great way to get a shared understanding amongst all the stakeholders you have about what it is that you're trying to achieve. And it's really 4 simple questions that you want answered. So what role will search play in the organization? How will we measure search success? What are the steps in the roadmap? And what are the risks? Now, at the end of this workshop, and it can involve more than one, there should be a shared understanding in the room about exactly what the vision for search is. Then what you do, you take this vision document with these answers, you send these to your stakeholders, but you also send it to your project team and maybe the people that you interview as well. If you have a clear, concise vision, you can really target those activities around requirements gathering and implementation to fit within that vision. It could save you a lot of time. And a vision workshop, in my mind, is the best way to do this. Get people together, get them talking, get everything out on the table, and come up with a super solid vision. The other thing is content. And really, if you've got crap content, you're going to have a pretty ordinary search experience. You need to understand 2 things about content in my mind. You need to understand the type of content that you have within the organization, but more importantly, how your users think about that content. Now, the way that I do this is doing something called a content audit. And a content audit essentially determines the sources of content, their use, who owns the content, when it was used, and exactly where it resides. It helps me understand the what, the why, the when, the who, and the where around content, the 5 W's. Now, the best way that I've found to do this is that you can do this via an interview, but I find using a simple content analysis spreadsheet, send this out to your particular stakeholders, and then get them to fill this out. You might need executives to support to make sure that people actually go through and do this exercise. But the spreadsheet is pretty simple. There's basically columns and rows, and each column we've got content type, so the type of content that this is not a SharePoint specific content type, it's just a general type of content, the location where it's stored, the owner of the content, the value to the organization, and the usage. By getting a really comprehensive understanding of the content within your organization, you're going to have a really easy time identifying those areas that you should target for search. It also gives you a fantastic deliverable to the organization as well, because this is frequently or hardly ever done, right? So I really think this is a super valuable step to take. The next phase is the requirements elicitation phase. And the goal of this phase is to really understand the needs of the organization and its users. This is your traditional requirements gathering phase. Now, there's lots of different ways to gather search requirements, and here are the 4 that I frequently use. The main thing is that you need a process that you will follow with proper techniques. You really need to have your requirements gathering activities planned before you engage users. You need to know what type of information you're trying to elicit. You don't want to waste people's time by going in and having a chat about search. And frequently what I've seen happen out there in the industry is people come in and they ask far too generic questions around search and you get far too generic answers. You don't want to waste people's time. You want to use real, solid techniques that have been proven out in industry that you can use to gather tangible search requirements. And there's 4 that I use in particular: user stories, surveys, workshops or interviews, and card sorts. Now I'm going to talk about user stories and card sorts. But surveys, great way to get search requirements from a wide variety of people, and workshops or interviews are the traditional approach of gathering requirements. But if you're doing workshops or you're doing interviews, make sure you follow workshop best practices. Have an agenda, have a time plan of what you're trying to do throughout the meeting, and have a goal for the meeting as well. Also, always follow up with your interviewees after you have gathered their information. Let's talk about user stories. User stories are a great way to get requirements from users in a format that's easily digestible to them. Now, user stories come from the agile world and allows end users to express their needs in an easily understandable format. I find that user stories work well because it gives just enough structure that users can actually create tangible search requirements, but there's also just enough leeway that they can think outside the box. Now, a typical user story format is as a persona, I want to do something so that I have some benefit. It's a pretty simple format for end users to follow. But once again, that little bit of structure helps ensure that that your search requirements activities don't become a chat, but you actually get tangible, valuable requirements. Now, what I find is the best way to run user stories, or the best way to elicit requirements via user stories, is user story workshops. So I pick a range of users depending on the requirements and arm them with cue cards, simple cue cards that they could write on. I get them to write 10 or 15 user stories facilitated by me. Then halfway through, I gather up the cards, I do a bit of shuffling, and I give the cards out to the other users. Now this really gives 2 advantages. First of all, the other users get to review the user stories to see if they're valuable or not. The other thing that you find is that frequently you'll find that this actually jogs people's memories and they start writing additional user stories as well. A quick tip about user stories as well. The action and the persona is very important, but I think the most important part of it is the so that, because it gives the whole user story context. And you really need that context in order to create a great search solution. The other technique that I use as well is card sorting. And card sorting is a way to find how people group and think about related information. It's an information architecture exercise taken from the user experience community, but it's got great value in search. It allows you to see maybe the types of content you should have in scopes, or how you should organize your taxonomy. But essentially, it allows you to view how users view information in the enterprise. Card sorting is pretty simple to do. You take a bunch of cards, you draw some categories or definitions or types of content, and then you get users to sort those cards into groups. Now there's 2 types of card sorts. We have an open card sort where users create their own categories, or we have a closed card sort where you get users to put the cards in predefined categories. I frequently use this for search scopes. For instance, if I wanted to determine what content should be in scopes, I can put the content down on cards and get people to then group those cards together into categories. So for instance, if I had a contract and I had 2 scopes, a financial scope or an investor relations scope, at the end of the card sort, I'm going to be able to determine what is the best scope to put that piece of content into. So once again, running a card sort, pretty easy. Create cue cards, get the users to sort the cards into categories. That can be done either online or in person. In person's great because not only do you get the kind of interaction with people and you get your end results, but I find that it's really the conversation between users that allows you to much better understand the organization. If you're going down the web route of card sorting, it's a great way because if you put enough people through it, it almost becomes like data. You know, if you have so many people running through card sorts, and I have been in organizations where I've run 500 people through card sorting exercises, you get a really great understanding of how the organization groups information. Now let's talk about expert judgment. And this is where your experience as a SharePoint, BA, consultant, analyst, whatever you want to call it, comes in, and you transfer your business or user requirements into functional specifications. This is where you can take your really tangible, great user business requirements you've written and then transform them into the SharePoint configuration options that ultimately creates a great search solution. Notice that in the previous two steps, I have never talked and never asked users about what they want to search on in a SharePoint specific vein. It's not a good practice. You need to talk to business users in a business context. How do you view information? How do you group information? You don't want to start giving them a whole range of SharePoint specific terms to decipher. They're not going to understand. Now, the way that I view search is really by four things. You can group, you can rank, you can filter, or you can view. Now, there's different ways that you can view how search can be implemented, but this is a rough guide that I use. What I'm going to go through how I implement scopes and some of the requirements inputs that I use, and also custom search results pages and some of the requirements inputs that I've shown earlier can be used to get custom search results pages and scopes implemented. So let's talk about scopes. Scopes are a great way to segregate the index for much more targeted results. But firstly, you need to know how your organization thinks about information for this to be effective. In my experience, each organization thinks about information differently, and hence their scopes are different. And some of the most common ones are you can have content-based scopes, so contracts, policies, procedures. Maybe your organization is much more task-based, so you have task-based scopes, new member accounts, terminations. A lot of organizations go around the storage-based scopes approach, stuff we have stored in SharePoint, stuff we have stored in CRM, stuff we have stored on the C drive. Some organizations, if they're fairly departmental-based, want department-based search scopes as well, accounting, human resources, and so forth. And one of the most interesting ones I find is time-based scopes, particularly for financial organizations. If a financial organization, through your requirements gathering activities, you determine that they search for content that is a year old 95% of the time, wouldn't you want to have a search scope which is content between 0 and 1 years? Because that scope is going to allow them to target those search results much more specifically, and then maybe have all of the other content in other time-based scopes as well. So how do we implement scopes? Well, there's 3 requirements inputs that I use and that are a great way to determine the types of scopes you need. Card sorts can tell you how your users group information, and maybe you want to model your scopes around that. It's a really good way to identify how users group info, and you can craft those scopes around that information. Content analysis is going to give you great insights into how your users think about information currently, and maybe you can craft your scopes around that as well. And personas are going to make sure that what you're creating in terms of scopes has the highest value to the highest percentage of users. Or alternatively, maybe you realize that you need to have different scopes for different personas. It's very common as well. In my experience, essentially always have a document search scope. For some reason, people always want to search for documents within SharePoint. Now, the reason is that documents are still the most used medium within many organizations. Don't use the word scope when talking to end users. Use the word filter. And filter can either be filter via refiners or filter via scopes. It's up to you to use that expert judgment, but don't use scopes. Don't use scopes when talking to end users. And too many scopes can be confusing. I find somewhere between 3 and 7 work pretty well. You don't want to have that search box crammed with hundreds of thousands of, hundreds or even tens of scopes over the top there. So be a little bit judicious with your scopes. Finally, custom search results pages. And custom search result pages are a super powerful capability to present different information based on different search queries. Now, it's fairly obvious that the users searching for different types of content will obviously want to see different information presented. So a great example for this is that if users are searching for contracts, maybe they want to see the applicable date of the contract to make sure that it's the latest one we have. So some inputs into custom search results pages. User stories are a great input, and many times it's the so that that's going to give you those great requirements, because you'll find that users will say something like, I want to do blah, 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 so that I can start processing these items when they expire. Well, if users want to know when the items expire, why not show that in the search results page? The content analysis as well is going to allow you to understand your content. And one thing that I find is that if you're making metadata marked as required for content, why not make it visible in the search results? It's going to give you two advantages. First of all, users aren't going to need to actually navigate to that particular piece of content to see that metadata. And secondly, you form a direct link between the user's minds, between adding a piece of metadata and it actually being visible in search. They find that that metadata becomes super useful. The other thing I do is something called a search results page workshops, where basically I sit down a bunch of users, I take a number of scopes or popular content, and then I ask users what they would want to see when these results appear. We do some ranking, we do some drawing and some sketching. We get some great information out of there. A really popular and common example is users when they're searching for pictures. When users search for pictures, they don't want to see the title of the photo necessarily. They want to see the thumbnail, the image size, and maybe the image date as well. So search results pages, once again, super powerful capability. Finally, let's talk about verification. And as part of your requirements gathering activities, you need to verify that what you're actually collected is correct. And verification ensures that your requirements are correct, and it also helps you identify new requirements as well. Now, there's a number of ways to verify and uncover new requirements, including 4 of the things I have up here: impression testing, search reporting, user feedback, and the how was your search web part. I definitely encourage you to look at impression testing. I think it's something that I frequently use, and it's a super cool way to determine if your whole SharePoint search implementation is structured correctly. The things I'm going to touch on is search reporting and the how was your search web part. Search reporting. Now really, search reporting is a fantastic way to verify that your solution is functioning correctly if you're in a POC or an agile format. So most people, when they gather search requirements, they implement some of these and they get their users to provide feedback. Search reporting is going to give you the tangible data that you need. It's also a great way to uncover new requirements. If you have an existing SharePoint search installation, particularly in 2010, you're going to get some fantastic reports that you can use to uncover new requirements that you can implement. Now, thankfully, SharePoint 2010 has got tons of awesome search reporting features. So really, it almost does it for you. And search reporting really is your best friend in terms of getting real feedback around what is going on. If you look at the site collection search reports, you can see things like the number of queries, the top queries, the failed queries. It's going to help you identify best bets, scopes, and finding popular queries as well. Best bets, it's going to tell you. If you want to benchmark or measure your search implementation, one of the things that you can do is look for a reduction in failed queries. It's fairly easy to measure using search reporting. I find search reporting is used nowhere near enough in terms of the power that it can offer to give you real insights into your organization. So make sure you look at those search reports. The other thing as well which I use is the how was your search web part. This is an awesome way to get feedback from users around how search is working when they search. Now, for some organizations, you're actually not allowed, organizations don't allow you to go and gather requirements from your end users. So how do you gain their feedback? The way that I do this is using this how was your search web part. And it's taken from this Habanero blog post. It's an organization that I used to work for. Essentially what we did was we used to take this feedback web part and put this on every search results page. So if a user searched and they didn't find what they want, or they did, there and then from the search results page, they can choose, did you find what you're looking for, yes or no, leave a comment, and then submit this. Now what would happen, this would be submitted to a list, where the list would contain the search term, the time of search, maybe the scope that they were using, and obviously their feedback as well. It's a great way to engage users to provide feedback. It works exceptionally well. Users are much more inclined to provide search feedback, and therefore another great tapped source of search requirements when they're searching. They're not quite as prepared to actually go and send an email to someone. This web part's really easy to implement, and I find that it really allows you to get a whole range of understanding from a broad range of users around how search is working within your organization. So that's all I have. It's a bit of a quick tour, I know. We only had half an hour, but listen, the main thing I want to get across is you need to understand how your users think about information, how they use information, and ultimately how they search information. And by using some of the requirements techniques that I've talked about in this presentation, you're going to get a real understanding and be able to write really fantastic, tangible search requirements that you're going to be able to implement to create an amazing search solution for your users.